we're now seeing a more overt alliance between Russia and China. And the trillion-dollar question now is, how deep does this go? How long has this been going on? Now, Western mainstream media is not really honest about this question, because this would touch upon very sensitive events in history and very, very concerning choices. And so all you get is the superficial explanation that this is sort of an alliance that was created ad hoc, that was born out of necessity, and that possibly China doesn't really want this alliance, and maybe Russia doesn't really want this alliance, but they have no other choice. And then you have so-called alternative media, and they should be able to give a much better answer. Maybe 20 years ago, they were actually able to get somewhat closer to the truth, but nowadays, alternative media is very much pro-Russia and very much pro-Republican. This, of course, wasn't the case during the Bush era, up until 2008, and same goes for the Clinton era before that. So I explained this in a different video on this channel, so please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. I've explained this starting in 2008. There was a big push by Republicans and Russians to virtually take over the narratives of alternative media. And so for quite a while, Western alternative media has promoted the idea that Russia is now a Christian conservative state, and Russia is an ally of American conservatives, sort of a global alliance, if you will. The problem is, Russia didn't get a clean break. There was no revolution. You didn't get any new people in power. You didn't get a true change in Russia. So you had the upper ranks of the military, you had the upper ranks of the Communist Party, and you had the upper ranks of the KGB. And so these three groups were just modifying the empire, and they all wanted to run it, but ultimately the KGB guys took the leading role. And they did form a special unit inside of the KGB, and they were the ones who took all the money, stole all the money, moved a lot of the money to foreign countries, especially the city of London. And then the KGB created these fake oligarchs in order to be able to move around in global markets and create this impression that there was an actual change in Russia. Now, the United States and Europe, they sort of aided that transition of the Russian Empire to a certain degree. The stated reason for that was to prevent a downfall of former Soviet territory and a breakup of the territory. So the big fear was that you would get 10 new governments, 10 new breakaway republics, and they would all be crazy, or some of them would be totally insane, and they would have nuclear weapons. So the idea was that Russia needed help, and that's why they could move their money to the city of London, and they got a bunch of help and technology sales and all of that. So in the 1990s and in the 2000s, of course, you had some conservatives in the West, especially from the Patriot movement, alternative media circles. And these conservatives, they didn't trust the developments in Russia at all. So they were concerned about a communist long-term strategy. So that means that Russia was just faking change. They were always aligned with China, and they would strike against the West in the future. Now, this sort of idea was supported by various defectors, such as Anatoly Golitsyn and others. They reported something along those lines, and they heard about that sort of strategy when they worked in Eastern Soviet Bloc intelligence agencies. In the 1960s, Professor Carroll Quigley, probably one of the smartest analysts of his era, Quigley put forward another idea. He thought this was even worse than that. He thought that there was a secret cartel of the superpowers. Back then it was only two. It was the United States and Soviet Russia, because they realized a full-out war made no sense for them. Any sort of grand nuclear battle would just be devastating, and it would just benefit regular other countries. The sensible thing for the superpowers to do would have been to fake these tensions, to scare the whole world, try to control parts of the world, and to prevent regular, normal countries from becoming too powerful. And to maintain that charade, that illusion, it required proxy wars every now and then, such as the old Korean War, Vietnam, or nowadays we're seeing something like that in Ukraine. This was a very interesting concept put forward by Professor Carroll Quigley. At the end of his really large book, Tragedy and Hope, most people got bored during the first 800 or 900 pages and they stopped reading. But then in the end, it's the grand finale. This is where the book really shines, because nobody else really has been talking about a secret cartel of the superpowers. So then came along the question of China. China was, to put it simply, China was split between the communists and the nationalists. And so the United States and the British colonial empire, they had the best experts stationed in China. The best generals, the best intelligence people. They had old Lord Louis Mountbatten, so people who actually benefited from Britain's knowledge about China, stemming from the old colonial days. And of course, America had all these resources, so most international observers thought this was a done deal. The nationalists would win in China, because the communists didn't have that much money. Strangely enough, the United States primarily pulled its financing for the Chinese nationalists. So the weapons deliveries, the ammunition deliveries, it all got less and less and less, to the point where the nationalists lost. And then the generals, they had to get in front of these congressional committees and explain themselves, and they said, without the necessary amounts of ammunition and weapons, there was no chance of winning. And a bunch of lame excuses were made why the United States government at the time effectively let the communists win in China. Now, this is very, very indicative of a secret deal between the US elites and the Russian elites. So they possibly hatched out this idea that China was going to be communist. And if you then look at the Chinese communist takeover, you will notice that all of this was orchestrated, paid for, and financed by Russia under Stalin. So this takeover of China was virtually done in the same way as a takeover done in Poland or Ukraine back then. The Sovietization of a captured country. But when it came to these Asian countries, China and North Korea, for strategic reasons, it was claimed that these Asian countries were somewhat independent. And there was sort of a rift between them and Russia, even though they were all communist. According to my research, the control of Russia over the Chinese communists, the control was virtually 100% because of these intelligence services and intelligence networks. So all these Chinese revolutionaries, they were all trained in Russia. The important ones were trained in Russia, and they were constantly surveilled to test their loyalties. And if you so much as doubted Moscow, if you had any intention of splitting from Moscow at a later stage, you were eliminated or you were replaced fairly quickly. So it appears that there is a much, much deeper bond between Russia and China up to this day. And it's not really that hard to guess if you know where to look, if you do some professional research about that. So this is in my view, what's really going on, and it's a giant cartel that nobody's supposed to know about. But so-called alternative media or classic conspiracy media, they put forward a different narrative. So they told a story about these international bankers that supposedly took over the British colonial empire and then the United States with nothing but basic intelligence methods and basic bank loans. But this was not really true. The British colonial empire was run by the most advanced cluster of dynasties. So they've been around for over 1,000 years, and they were the best in the game. And these aristocratic dynasties, they created modern banking, especially the fractional reserve banking. So they didn't need any outsiders to create that, but they chose to use some outsiders, and they chose to create the illusion of modern capitalism, with oligarchs. So the old empire was building, creating fake oligarchs. And the United States government progressively copied the British model and took it even further. So America didn't have any aristocrats visibly running things, but a lot of these techniques were copied almost verbatim. But according to alternative media or conspiracy media, these oligarchs then came up with a fairly silly plan. And the plan was to prop up communism, to support communism in Russia and then in China, in order to either merge with these communist countries or to have a big fight, to battle the Eastern Bloc in a huge war and then win this war. So, but nowadays we see this more overt alliance between Russia and China. And many in the alternative sphere, they don't know what to make of it. They thought Russia was Christian conservative. Why are they aligned with the communists? And then these alternative media influencers, they don't know what's going to happen next and how they will appear then. So if you now support this Eastern alliance, if you support it too much, and then China attacks not only Taiwan, but maybe shoots down a strike carrier group of the US or destroys the US base in Guam, then these influencers would look like traitors, basically. And that's why these influencers are now putting forward all kinds of different narratives in order to be able to position themselves so they don't look too bad later on if something dramatic happens. I wrote up some notes concerning alternative media reports over the last couple of months dealing with this Russian-Chinese alliance. And I found a couple of interesting things. Now, I've looked at a platform, for example, InfoWars, because it's fairly large and they also host other people's material. They host other people's shows. They have a lot of guests that also appear on other shows. So if you look at InfoWars, basically, you can get a sense of what alternative media is thinking in general. Now, the first thing that you'll notice is that the alternative conservative sphere is very, very concerned and very irritated by how the Democrats have shifted in their positions. So usually Democrats and leftist money people like George Soros, they've been rather pro-Chinese, and they were promoting political shenanigans, they were promoting trade and all that. But now the Democrats are really anti-China, and even George Soros is now anti-China. And so if things get heated, if things get dramatic, if there's an invasion of Taiwan or something bigger, then the Democrats could get a large boost with the voters, because if there's a war, people usually stand behind the government. And the old, frail Joe Biden, he doesn't seem like an aggressive imperialist, even though he has like the mighty DuPont clan behind him. And of course, he's working for an established empire. But he doesn't look like an aggressor, so that could benefit him and could benefit the Democrats, and that would leave Republicans in the dust. They're very worried about that. So now you're seeing in alternative media the talking point that the left, the Democrats and these people, they caused this mess to happen. They supposedly supported China in the past. They had a deal with China in the past, to create this big merge at some point. But now China has betrayed them. China supposedly has betrayed the so-called globalists. And these globalists supposedly were stupid, very naive, and even mentally ill. Now, of course, that's an easy cop-out way to not provide a plausible explanation. It's just an excuse. You just call these globalists so stupid that they neglected basic safety strategies. So why make a deal with the Chinese? Why build them up? Why help them? Why prop them up if you're not sure what's going to happen? So no experienced empire would ever do something like this. There always have to be built-in safety mechanisms. Always. This is absolutely key. And so another point is that Western elites, especially American elites, they not only supported China, they also supported Russia. As I explained earlier, the idea was to prevent a collapse of Russia. And what sense does it make to prop up and help two enemies that have been historically aligned? It makes absolutely no sense. So you can't use that cop-out explanation that the globalists are just stupid. And so if China attacks Taiwan, if something dramatic happens, alternative media will probably just repeat that talking point, that it's the Democrats' fault and they messed up and they had to deal with the Chinese and the Chinese betrayed them. But what are the Democrats going to say? They're going to say the Republicans as well had dealings with China. The old networks like Skull and Bones, they propped up China. Was Bush Sr. as president, or even as a quasi-diplomat for China, Bush Sr. opened up Western markets to communist China. And these powerful corporations such as Bechtel, they helped China along the way to become a superpower. So it's not going to really make much of a difference if you just repeat these talking points when things get heated. Then I noticed former General Michael Flynn. He used to run the intelligence agency DIA. He's been very pro-Russian, and he almost became the national security advisor under President Trump. And he was a guest on a show alongside Dr. Sherry Tenpenny and many others, and he was supposed to talk about why China is now so close to Russia. And so you may have expected a long-winded, maybe even interesting explanation, but you didn't get that. So Flynn just briefly mentions these new treaties between Russia and China. He calls it fascinating, and then he diverts to a different topic, namely the Trump indictment, and then he just blabs along, and just really avoids the issue altogether. So, of course, he got into trouble. He supposedly lied about his contacts to the Russian ambassador. He once visited the Russian military intelligence agency in Moscow, the GRU, and that sort of thing. He was part of a gala dinner in Moscow honoring the Russia Today media outlet, and he was sitting next to President Vladimir Putin. So, very odd. I mean, it's a problem if you just excuse that based on ideology, claiming, well, Russia is conservative, so that supposedly makes it okay. It's way more complicated than that. So here we have somebody who is a trained intelligence guy who should give a sober analysis of this Russian-Chinese alliance, but he just calls it fascinating. And then he stops talking about it. You know, he doesn't, apparently he doesn't want to be too specific because he doesn't know what's going to happen next. He doesn't know if China will attack Taiwan in a week or in a year, and, you know, he could look really bad when he talks too much. So next, I found a clip over at InfoWars by Owen Schroyer, and he offered the following interpretation. Joe Biden had basically forced the hands of Vladimir Putin. So he left Putin no choice but to get closer and move ever closer to the Chinese. And this is not what Putin wanted. Okay, so it's supposed to be pure pragmatism, right? But it never made sense for Russia to expect Russia to become a partner for America. You know, it didn't make sense during the Bush era when George W. Bush said they wanted to draw Russia closer, to get Russia more into the NATO camp, because it's someday there may be a confrontation against China, and then we want Russia in our camp. But that didn't make sense back then because Russia has always been very close to China. And let's not forget, Bush was a member of Skull and Bones, and as I said, Skull and Bones Network, they had supported China a lot, you know, through corporations such as Bechtel and others. So this is an excuse basically offered by Owen Schroyer, and this is a talking point you can find in different other places. So this is supposed to take Putin out of the hot seat. It's supposed to relieve him of his responsibilities. You know, he supposedly had no other choice but to get closer to China. Then we had something interesting. The guest on the InfoWars show hosted by Owen Schroyer. The guest was Joel Skousen. Now, I've interviewed him myself. You can find the video on this channel. It has more than 1 million views. And back then, I asked him the question, why are so many American conservatives, why are they pro-Russia? How could they have fallen for this Russian propaganda? And Skousen basically laid down his opinion on what the superpowers are doing. And he believes the West had supported Russia and China because the West wanted them to attack. And once the Eastern Bloc attacks, America will be somewhat weakened. America will form a deeper political alliance with other NATO countries, and then this new alliance would then beat the Eastern Bloc. That's kind of what the West is intending, according to Skousen. Now, the Eastern Bloc, of course, wants to be victorious, according to Skousen. So that's his opinion. Now, I may differ from Skousen's opinion. I suspect it's more of a full-on secret cartel, and they can write the script and then implement the script. But nevertheless, Skousen's view is much more interesting than what you see on alternative media nowadays. Now, Skousen is one of the old schoolers. I mean, he's been around forever, and he used to be respected. And but the younger generation of influencers, such as Alex Jones, they have moved away from some very important thoughts. And now you have the even younger generation, such as Owen Schroyer, who hasn't even read elemental books about the topics that he's talking about. So, Skousen in this guest appearance at InfoWars with Owen Schroyer, Skousen he complains about American conservatives being pro-Russia, and he lays down the scenario that he thinks it's going to happen. Schroyer believes passionately that Russia is a partner for the US. Skousen says Russia and China have been coordinating for decades, and this is a long-term plan. Schroyer doesn't believe that the Soviet Union's structures still exist covertly, and Schroyer then says Putin Schroyer believes that Russia truly has become conservative. And they've been pushing the Orthodox Church and all this. So apparently Schroyer doesn't even know that the Russian Orthodox Church has been run by the KGB for a long time, and then this control continued under the new iteration of the KGB intelligence service. So lack of basic knowledge here that you can tell, and it's really irritating for Skousen, because he used to think that people in the Patriot movement should know these things. And so Skousen then mentions that at least until 2014, the West had supported Russia, and they let Russia get away with almost anything. And so the talk gets really heated. Skousen insists that Russia was never a true partner for the United States and will never be. And he asks Schroyer, where do you get this stuff? Where do you get this idea? And Schroyer himself gets very irritated, and he starts yelling because Schroyer believes he's absolutely correct, and everybody in his circles is saying the same thing. Skousen mentions the Soviet defector Golitsyn, who warned about a communist long-term strategy of Russia and China. And that book, that Golitsyn book, used to be sold at the InfoWars store, says Skousen, but Schroyer hasn't read it. So this is a really interesting exchange between those two. Now, according to Skousen, Ukraine was a way in which the West could start to be more openly hostile towards the East. So it needs an example. It needs an event to start, or maybe be more open about these hostilities. And at a later stage, the big attack from the Eastern Bloc will come, according to Skousen, and then the West will win. So all three superpowers want this next world war, according to Skousen. And so you can't prevent it in any way by, trying to get closer to Russia, and you can't prevent this war by abandoning Ukraine. But this is what Schroyer believes, right? Schroyer thinks that if you abandon Ukraine, if you hand over Ukraine to Russia, this would de-escalate things, and this would keep Russia and China apart, which is a very, very naive and dangerous idea. Schroyer can't believe that Russia would be deceptive for 20 years. That they would fake being conservative and that sort of thing. And Skousen then argues the Ukraine war has weakened Russia's capabilities, military capabilities, and will continue to do so. America is increasing its ammunition production and all the sorts of things. So this would actually benefit America. So then, when the Chinese announced that they were effectively, or pretended they were effectively ready to attack Taiwan, or make even some other attacks, alternative media was giving a very baseline view on that. It was just lamenting the situation, and didn't give much further interpretation of the situation. They don't want to look bad if China does something huge. And so if China does something dramatic, alternative media influencers will then claim they had warned about this, and they had complained about this earlier, and that makes these influencers look better. Over the last couple of weeks, you saw a few reposts, or maybe more than a few reposts on InfoWars, of stories by the Russian media outlet RT. So this is Russian propaganda, but this Russian propaganda actually contains Chinese propaganda. So in these reposts, these Russian journalists are writing that China is becoming more powerful, and they had these diplomatic wins over the last couple of weeks and months, and that sort of thing. And this is sort of a way for InfoWars, for example, to introduce Chinese propaganda to the audience by using Russian media as a proxy. So this is like a trial balloon. There have been claims over at InfoWars, and we've seen them elsewhere too. Claims that Xi Jinping, Chinese ruler, that he's supposedly anti-communist, and he is going to end communism in China, or he wants to create a massive change in China. Now, this is a nice fantasy, but of course, it's completely removed from reality. So if Trump becomes president again, if Ron DeSantis becomes president, alternative media has to then reshuffle some of the narratives and try to make it fit. Now we've seen Trump announcing that he would cut all these great deals and he would fix all these situations. And we've seen Ron DeSantis saying he's not interested that much in Ukraine. He's more interested in pushing back China. But if there's a Russian-China alliance, you can't just push back China. You also have to push back Russia. And if you don't want to do it directly against Russia, you have to do it indirectly, such as through Ukraine. So then, of course, so of course there would be more military help for Ukraine under a President Ron DeSantis. So what are alternative media people then going to say? Are they going to support this? Are they going to offer a few conflicting narratives? Well, we'll see about that. You can find some more background info on the biggest secrets behind China. You can find this on this channel. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. And I will get into these topics more and more in the near future. Just how the Chinese Revolution happened play by play, and how the communists were allowed to win, and how Russia had almost complete control over these Chinese revolutionaries.